thank you very much. This afternoon I'm going to be speaking about the media treatment and communication needs of the Sudanese Australian population in the Australian context. Any of you who've been following media in the last 2 or 3 years, whether through newspapers, through online media, through other sources, would have seen these sorts of headlines coming up with relative frequency. Issues around far from the war, beauty pageant sparks violence, police figures show hundreds of Sudanese charged with assault, ugly scenes following beauty pageant, violence a way of life. What we see when we begin to look at the media and how media represents Sudanese Australians in Victoria and more generally in Australia are a range of stereotypical representations, a range of problematic representations that present Sudanese people in particular contexts and in particular ways. Some of the key words here from these sort of typical headlines: violence, police, ugly scenes, war. We begin to see a picture that occurs time and again of a particular population group within the Australian context being represented in a particular and specific way. As I'll go on to discuss, one of the other critical dimensions of this is the range of representations which are not occurring. So we get a particular set of representations occurring, but then also silences in terms of other ways in which Sudanese people and other population groups are interacting with and engaging in the Australian context. I want to take a step back before we get more specifically into some specific examples around media coverage to think about the significance of this issue. For me and my colleagues in this research project, one of the underlying features that we're really interested in is the broad question of what makes a good society. How do we think about that? What should we be striving for? A critical aspect of what makes a good society, we argue, is a society that's striving to achieve social justice. That clearly embodies a range of different dimensions: the capacity to access, to mobilise resources, the capacity to access, integrate work with rights, so on. We also argue that a critical dimension of a good society and of social justice is the notion of belonging. When we talk about belonging and discussions around belonging, we're very much arguing around a capacity to feel part of society, to be able to participate in society, to be able to be included in the activities across the political, economic and social context of society. In the Australian context, and as this image represents, one of the critical dimensions through which that sense of belonging at least attempts to be promoted is through multiculturalism. Clearly a key dimension of Australian policy over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been the striving to achieve a multicultural society. Related to that, also increasingly attempts to promote ideas around social inclusion, which then also link back to issues around social justice. What we argue in our research, my colleagues and I argue in our research, is that this struggle for social inclusion, the struggle for multiculturalism, are part of a broader set of struggles around belonging, which link back to particular versions or ideas about what a good society should be. Again, as we go through the discussion, we'll see that in the Australian context, as in many other contexts, a range of significant challenges, problems emerge in terms of trying to achieve the goal of belonging and of social inclusion. When we try to bring that down to a more specific level, one of the issues we can begin to ask is, how should we promote belonging? What can we do to promote forms of belonging? One of the key ways in which belonging can be promoted is through forms of communication, whether that's through individual communication, group communication, but clearly also through the mass media, whether it's through newspapers and broadcast or through newly emerging forms of media, online media, social media. Critical aspects of those forms of communication are firstly the capacity to have a voice. Who has a voice in the media? And when we think about debates around newly emerging forms of media, we see an argument that we're potentially moving away from, in the Australian context, a context where mainstream media is very concentrated in terms of ownership, to a potential much more broad opening up of the range of people who have access to be presenting a voice. But the other dimension of communication is clearly listening. It's one thing to be able to put a voice out there. Critical issue is who's listening to that voice. Where are the dialogues going on? Where are the interactions? Where are the relationships that are forming? If I've got my own individual blog, I put my views out there. Who's listening to that? Who's interacting with me? What's the difference between myself and the Murdochs of the world, who've obviously got a much bigger platform? So communication, and in the media context, is not only about being able to express a perspective or a voice, but who's engaging with it, who's listening to it. So that's in a sense the framework or some of the critical issues that we see emerging around communication and very much a significant aspect of achieving social justice, and in our particular research looking at the experience of Sudanese Australians. Bring this to a more grounded level. If we think about Australian migration policy, immigration policy over the last 20 years or so, a major aspect of immigration policy has been humanitarian resettlement programs. 1990s and 2000s, we've seen an increasing focus on African nations as well as a range of other nations. And within that broad context, Sudanese Australians have partaken in those programs in large numbers. Question that immediately arises is, what's the experience of people coming from African countries to Australia? We've got an ideal of multiculturalism, of social inclusion. What's the practice on the ground? 2010, the Australian Human Rights Commission undertook a range of research around the experience of African Australians in general in the Australian context, and found that while there are some positive aspects to life for African Australians in the Australian context, there are also significant experiences around discrimination, racism, social exclusion. That occurred across a range of areas. Importantly, in the context of our research, also occurred through the media. And in terms of media representations, what the Australian Human Rights Commission found in their research was not only are there problematic representations of African Australians in terms of stereotypes, in terms of assumptions, and not only are those representations problematic in themselves, but that they have long-term consequences. So the people who were interviewed as part of the research for this, for example, reported, when I go to get a job, an employer engages with me at one level, at a visible level. If I'm a visibly different person, they've got an image of me from what they've read in the media. They then carry that image or that understanding to their interaction with me at a personal level. So there's sort of discriminatory practices that are not only significant and problematic in terms of what's going on in everyday media, but in terms of the long-term consequences for people's lives, and again linking back to those debates around social justice and social inclusion. So taking our starting point from this sort of reports, these sorts of debates, my colleagues and I, and this is a research project that involves colleagues from Swinburne University and the University of Melbourne, as well as La Trobe University. We also have industry partners, including the ABC and AIMS, as well as a range of other participants who I'll talk about. Very much wanted to focus on, firstly, if we look at a more specific group within that general category of African Australians, what is their experience like in terms of representations? If we then think that's problematic or there are some challenges to that, can we do anything, or what can we do to try and transform those representations, or to create a space where voice and listening can actually occur? So we've set up a multi-dimensional research project involving researchers from disciplines including management, sociology, media and communication, and journalism. And the first part of our project was to try and get an empirical picture of what is the media coverage of Sudanese Australians like in the Australian context. We very much have focused in the first stages on print media, in the mainstream print media, in particular in Victoria. Through our analysis of that print media over a period of time, we've found that a range of key themes begin to emerge in terms of how Sudanese Australians are represented in the mainstream media. Those four key themes being around nationhood, violence, difficulties in Sudan, and human interest stories. Just very briefly, the nationhood stories tend to focus on very explicitly issues of belonging. So typically get stories about how are Sudanese Australians integrating into the Australian context. And again, we get into a range of debates around sort of problematic concepts such as integration, assimilation, and so on. But a range of stories talking about nationhood, about the experience of Sudanese Australians and their life in Australia. We also get a range of stories about violence in the Australian context, either Sudanese people like being the perpetrators of violence or being the victims of violence. A range of stories also about difficulties in Sudan, so looking back to the country of origin and the experience of migrating to Australia. And then finally, human interest stories, which are typically the stories around a person who's had a difficult life experience and then has struggled and has had some sort of success, or has struggled and is continuing to face problems. And a range of stories beginning to emerge, but we also argue a range of stories with a relatively limited focus. So again, time and again, these are the sorts of areas where Sudanese Australians are represented in the media. Whole range of other sorts of issues, life experiences and so on are not represented in these stories. Also significant is the question of who's actually got voice in these stories. And again, Typical sort of representation is figures of authority speaking on behalf of the Sudanese community. Relatively rare to see members of Sudanese Australian communities having a voice in the mainstream media. What we've then argued from that is there's clearly a range of media representation occurring, but there are also some challenges or problems with it. What can we do to try and transform or engage with that? So as the research team, what we've done over the last couple of years is to develop a training program initiative. Basically, the starting point for that is to say, if we think there are problems with media representation, how can we interact with, engage with members of the Sudanese community to try and provide a space where they can have a voice, where they can begin to give a different perspective to what we see in the mainstream media. So training program, and here's just a snap of sort of a brainstorming session, trying to develop what the training program would look like. Typically involves around 10 to 12 weeks of sessions, 12 to 15 people participating in the training program, and the training is really organised around two key aspects. Firstly, providing a range of technical skills, how to write a story, how to access sources, how to frame particular issues. So providing those sort of technical skills that journalists need, but also critically in terms of the training program, we argue that there's a really significant dimension that needs to be about relationships. So as in many industries, to be able to get your stories out there, to interact with people, what are the relationships that you can form? So through the training program, we've had mainstream journalists come in and provide training. So part of that is because they've got the skills, but also it's an opportunity for participants in the training program to interact with journalists, to speak with them informally, to make those sort of soft networks, those relationships that may be beneficial further down the track. Related to that, we've also set up a mentoring program in the training, whereby the participants in the training program, and here we've got a couple of our participants, Cot in the front foreground there, where they're involved in mentoring relationships with journalists. They go to the journalist's place of work, they meet with them outside of class, again trying to build up that social capital, those relationships that may provide opportunities, and again just give access to sort of knowledge that can't necessarily gain just from being in a classroom context. So the training program is very much organised both around technical skills, but also recognising the significance of the social side of journalism and of communication. I've had 2 full rounds of the full training as well as a pilot. What are some of the outcomes of that? In concrete terms, some of the outcomes include the setting up of a blog by participants in the training program. So as a first step, recognise a way to get different perspectives or get stories out there from a different perspective to give voice to the participants in the training program. So again, that's one form of voice. The question is, who's listening to that? And difficult to measure in some ways, but we had some indication through last year where a couple of issues emerged. Some of the mainstream media had obviously logged on or found the blog. They started to approach participants in the training program to get their particular perspective or their viewpoint on the particular issue. So relatively small steps, but nevertheless an indication of at least the beginning of an opening up of a dialogue. Ideally, where we'd like to see the blog go is that it's a blog that's controlled by the participants in the training program, becomes an independent site of media, an independent and strong source, but also it's a site that does create relationships with other forms of media and becomes recognised as a significant site for information coming from the Sudanese Australian community and from the participants in the research project. So again, what we're seeing, what we're arguing is that when we think about social justice, about the promotion of a good society, communication is a critical dimension of that. When we think about communication processes, when we look to media as a form of communication, some significant challenges with how the mainstream media covers particular groups. We're arguing that providing training, providing this sort of context is a way to at least begin to challenge those sorts of dominant framings or dominant narratives. And again, within that, while we're focused on a particular population group within the Australian context, we think there are certainly lessons here that could be provided in other contexts that could be picked up by people working or members of other social groups within the Australian context. So finish, there are significant issues in terms of media representation, forms of social inclusion and exclusion. If we think communication is a critical voice, a critical space for the promotion of belonging. We need to be thinking creatively about ways that we can promote forms both of voice and of listening. Thanks very much.